Welcome to the Mullen Automotive Museum here in Oxnard, California. I'm Rick Eberst. I've been a docent here at the museum for about 10 years. And today we have a very special, and I'm very excited about this because we're going to be looking at the 1911, one of the earliest cars we have in our collection. 1911 Hispano-Suiza. It's called the Alfonso 13 car. It's a race car. And to help us understand and learn more about this car, I'm bringing in my docent, Jay Murphy. Come on in, Jay. Jay's been a docent here for about 5 years, and he's actually a former pilot in the Air Force, so he knows a lot about flight, and of course flying this little car would be quite an interesting experience. Jay's also, we both went to the University of Maryland together. So.
Yes, we did.
So
Rick's
Jay,
a couple of years in front of me, though.
Yeah, thank you, Jay, for coming. We really appreciate taking time out to be here with us today and help walk through this car and kind of look at it in depth.
My name is Jay, as Rick said, Jay Murphy. I've been a docent here at the museum for not quite 5 years now. It's been a real experience for me. Today we're going to talk about an interesting car. It's not the typical car you might think you'd see when you walked into the Mullen. It doesn't have Fagoni fenders or anything like that on it. And the prime reason for that is that it's a very early car. As Rick stated, this is a 1911 car. This is before the First World War. Hispano-Suiza started at the turn of the last century, right around the 1900s. It started in Barcelona, Spain, which is kind of a rare spot for cars. In terms of automobile industry, Barcelona was actually kind of a backwater. Most of the things were happening in the main European countries, France and Italy and Germany. Hispano-Suiza got a lot of its impetus, and you can tell a lot about the company just from this logo right here on the front of the car. There's two flags there. One is a red and yellow flag on the top. That's the flag of Spain. The other flag beneath it is the Swiss flag, and that's red with the white cross from Switzerland. They're emblematic, actually, of the two people who I think were probably the prime movers for Hispano-Suiza. The top one would be King Alfonso, the Spanish flag. He was the king of Spain. He was a big car personality. He loved cars. He enjoyed driving. He wasn't a racer, but he certainly participated in a lot of the things going on about fast driving events around Barcelona. But the king wanted Spain to get ahead and catch up at least with the other European countries. So he decided to go into racing, and he pushed the company Hispano-Suiza to do that. That brings up the second flag, which is the Swiss flag, and it's representative of a gentleman named Mark Burkett. A lot of people think he was one of the better engineers of the last century. Mark Burkett, as far as I'm concerned, along with the king, are probably the two prime motivators of the company Hispano-Suiza. And if you had to pick one to the bitter end, it was probably Mark Burkett who went all the way. The king wanted to get sleepy Spain into that picture, so he was very motivated to move to racing in Europe. And Mark Burkett also wanted to get there because he wanted to sell more Hispano-Suiza cars. And he knew for a fact that Europe was the market where he would be most successful. They did that, and in fact they took it a step further, and they actually built a new factory outside of Paris. And once again, this is where Mark Burkett shone. He put the factory together in record time. He found the property that they needed to build it on, and he began producing cars literally in very short order. That's where we're going to transition to this car, because this King Alfonso was one of the first cars to come off of the French production line. This was one of 25 cars built. This is one of 3 remaining today. And it's a small car. It only has a 2.4 meter chassis on it. I like to say that the name on the car is literally almost as long as the car itself. This is officially a 1911 Hispano-Suiza 45 CR King Alfonso XIII Voiturette car. So like I say, it's quite a name for a diminutive car like this, but it's quite a car. This is actually in a period in time before we really had anything standardized in cars. And once again, Mark Burkett comes through and does some very innovative design features on the car. The motor for this car is not very sophisticated. It's a monoblock, a 4-cylinder, and we'll show you that motor in just a couple of minutes. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about the outside of the car. When you notice the front of this car, this is a strange looking radiator compared to the typical radiators of the day. They're typically flat. This is at an angle to streamline it and get better airflow over that part of the car in order to increase its speed and theoretically increase its reliability and performance. When we move back along the car, this is, although it's very subtle on this car, a lot of people indicate that this is one of the first cars or the founding cars for what was called later on in the 20s and 30s a torpedo body style. And when you look at this body essentially rises up. It expands both horizontally and vertically as it comes back, kind of creating more of a funnel shape like this, which is where the torpedo shape started. This also has what we would call a natural windscreen. A lot of people talk about windshields. This is an actual windscreen. As the air came over here and hit this, it would reflect up, hopefully out of the driver's eyes. Mark Burkett did a lot of other design features. Up front on the car, he has some cues in here that allow him to tighten and soften the suspension on the car depending upon the kind of roads they were on. Remember, this car was primarily used for racing or autocrossing. The factory raced them, but a wealthy individual like the king could buy a car like this and take it racing, and they were very, very, very successful at it. Keep in mind, this was a race car, and the driver who sat over there typically had a gentleman sitting next to him here called the riding mechanic. And believe it or not, that riding mechanic had a lot to do. He had to make sure the gas tank was pressurized. He had to make sure there was oil in the engine to keep it running and those kind of things. You frequently see pictures of the driver and the mechanic, and inevitably you see the riding mechanic with his arm around the driver's shoulder. It's not because they were good friends. It's because there were no seat belts, and if they hit a bump, the riding mechanic was gone. He was out of the vehicle and bouncing down the road somewhere. So this was a trial and error kind of way. Keep in mind that the roads that these guys were racing on were not really roads as we would think of today. They were frequently never paved. They were cobblestone sometimes. They were dirt roads. Frequently they were just two-lane rut roads that were driven primarily by carriages and horse-drawn vehicles. So it was a bit of a rough and tumble day back then. So as I said, there's no seat belts. There's a reason for that as well. A lot of very famous drivers, even later on in life, but certainly in this period, thought that they had a better chance of surviving if they were thrown out of the car if they were in a crash. In other words, they were taking the chance that they'd hit the soft grass as opposed to the boulder on the side of the road. The reason for that was simple. They did not want to be caught underneath the car if there was a fire going on. When you come to the rear of the car here, and you look at this gas tank, two things are really evident. It's about 3 inches or 4 inches from the driver's back, and it is just a welded, seamed tank. In any kind of an impact, that tank would split open and there would be gas literally everywhere. These guys would be scrambling, and they thought they had a better chance on getting out of the car if they didn't have a seatbelt on. That obviously changed later on in racing, but back in the day, that's the kind of thing they were thinking.
Jay, I have some questions about the fuel tank back here. You pointed out that it's right behind the seat of the driver and the mechanic.
This is a very, non-sophisticated tank. As I said, it's just welded. But what's gone on here is that somebody had to figure out, probably Mark Burkett, how to get the gas from back here up to the engine up front. And the way they did that was by pressurizing the tank with air. This little bar right here would come down, and this riding mechanic we talked about would furiously pump like this, pressurizing air into the tank, which in turn would force these lines to fill up with gas, and they would run out to the engine up front, giving the car enough to get down the road. That had to continue to happen during the race. Oil had the same issue, by the way. When you come up in here, these are the equivalent of older school oilers. This car has a sump that keeps its oil, but essentially you needed to keep replenishing the oil, and the riding mechanic, his responsibility, among other things, was to do both of those. He, by the way, also could turn his head around and see what was behind him, so it wasn't quite as critical not to have the rearview mirror up here. So quite a little piece going down the road. There's a lot of speed to it.
Quite interesting, in fact, that you're a former pilot, too, and how that relates to your interest in cars. I mean, it's kind of the same.
Well, there's a lot of similarities, and believe it or not, I, like a lot of people I mentioned earlier, I was much more familiar with Hispano-Suiza from their V8 engines than I ever was for their cars. When we got here and I saw cars like this, I went, wow, there's a whole other world out there in the automotive world which I hadn't hit on. Hopefully all the people watching out there will realize that as well. But we typically don't open up the engines here at the museum. But Rick, maybe you can pull the hood on this thing and we'll talk a little bit about it.
Believe me, my pleasure. Ta-da.
Chassis number 814, and it's kind of famous because this is a matching numbers car. Those of you who are collectors out there really can appreciate that. Typically you want a car where the engine and the drivetrain and the chassis all started life together at the factory. This is one of those cars. This engine and this chassis have been together for 109 years. So it's quite a motor. This is actually a 3.6 liter, it's actually 3,616 cc motor. It puts out 64 horsepower. And it's a monoblock. Essentially, there's no real head on it like you and I would think of in a modern engine today. It's very difficult to work on. Part of the problem is the compression heads on this are shaped like a T, and because of that, it's a difficult car to keep compression in. Mark Burkett apparently worked on that throughout the life of the car, and what he did was he enhanced it to the point where even though it was kind of a dud in terms of engine design, he enhanced it and pushed it far enough to make it a very, very agile performer. It did very well on the track, won a number of races. It also won a number of hill climb events with privateers, as I mentioned earlier.
There's some up front, there's a really interesting fan belt, as you can see, that up here that's a combination of what looks like flat pieces surrounded by rubber tire, basically, that have been linked together. If you look closely down here, you can see there's a rod that goes from the front that comes down to the very front of the crankcase, and that's where in the front of the car, if you look at the front, you can actually see the crank that you used to start this car. So the idea would be that you take the strap off here that holds up the front, you would push this in to the rod end to engage the crankshaft, and then you would turn it. You always want to make sure you keep your thumb off the side because it backfires and come back and smash your hand. So you crank it and then pull it back out so that it's not continually turn as the engine turns. So it isn't a really easy car to get started, and it's something that you have to be able to do, like we mentioned earlier, if you were in an accident or whatever and you had to get out of the car, you were thrown out of the car, and you came back, the car might have been stalled, you got to come all the way up here in the front and get it started again. Well, we're over here on the right-hand side of the engine in this beautiful Hispano-Suiza, 4 cylinders we said earlier, and on the very top, the first thing you see, there's a little small cup on each of the top of the cylinders, and it has a little lever with a knob on it, and when they're in the up position as they are now, you would put a little gas in each one of these cups with maybe a squirter, and then you would turn this valve down, and when you turn that valve down, the hole appears and the gas would then run down into the cylinder, and that would prime the cylinder. So that's how you would, one way to get it started. You also see the spark plug wires that come up from the magneto down here and come up over the top and over to the spark plugs. Also on the carburetor is the float chamber over here, and you can see possibly up here it says Weber. Some of you probably heard of Weber carburetors before, and so this is a Weber carburetor. It's actually a side draft carburetor. Down below it on the magneto, on the very front of the magneto, there's a little lever here that you pull up, and that's where you can oil the drive shaft that drives the magneto. Just a little bit behind the magneto, you'll see the push rod. There's actually 4 of them that are in here, and they're open architecture, they're exposed, and this is where one of the things you would do, as I mentioned, that you would come down and oil these things from the outside before you started them. And that's kind of an interesting feature that was on engines at the time, that the push rods were on the outside of the engine.
Okay, I wanted to point out this as well. We talked about this a little bit, I believe, before. This is essentially a pump to push air into the gas tank to force the fuel up to the engine up here. So it's simply a pressurized tank where you would merely pump it like this. What I'm doing, like pumping up a bicycle, is I'm pumping air into the tank, into the reservoir, and that will shoot the gas forward like this. When it's done, I'd put it up like that and get it out of the way. Any other controls you want to point out?
Sure. To the left, I think there's another pump that comes down, pulls down, and I believe that pumps another pump to pump oil up to the top part of the engine of the car. A lot of these cars only had the crankshaft slapping into the kind of the reserve, but I think this is also a 100% loss car too in terms of the oil, but you needed to put oil up to the top, so that would be something you would pump. Over here to the right of the air pump, you can see a circular one. That's actually the ignition switch, and you put a key in there and turns. A little different than most cars. Most cars, you put the key in, and then you have another button. On Bugattis, you push the key, you put the key in, turn it, and then you push the key in actually, and that starts the starter. This is the vehicle identification plate just below there. There is the St. Christopher medal above that. And then there's only 2 gauges on this car. One is just the fuel, and the other is just the temperature gauge. Below these 2 gauges, there are 2 other units that are actually plungers, and that's to push oil to different parts of the car so you can lubricate the car this way. It used to be, when you were driving a car, you had to get out and lubricate it every 15, 20 kilometers. And this was something that allowed you to drive and pump this in that format. That's another format, the thing that was developed by Pannar. If you look at some of the Pannars, they'll have a beautiful copper or brass tank that has a variety of pumps on it to put oil to all different places. When we look at the engine, I'm going to point out that it has external push rods. And so before you start the car, you have to lubricate those external push rods. So you would frequently see people driving these cars, they would have a smock on or something to protect themselves from the weather and whatever is being thrown up from the road, which was common. And of course, a lot of horse-drawn carriages on the road at the same time. A little bit of biological material that would be thrown your way. And the reason you would see them all dressed up like this, and then they would have an oil can, and they would go out and have to lubricate the car to get it going. Just right in the middle, where you might think there might be a tachometer, there's a lever, thank you, and that lever is the choke. So it's connected to a lever that connects to the carburetor, and so you can see maybe there's a C on it, so that's full choke, and then you got different partial elements for that. All the pedals and a lot of other things in this car are brass, and some probably are bronze, but a lot of brass alloys at least in
Everything is beautifully manufactured too. Keep in mind, nothing on this car was touched with any kind of exotic machinery at all. This was all handcrafted material.
But I'm just trying to imagine driving this car in 1911 and doing what, 85?
Roughly 80 miles an hour this car would be capable of, yeah.
Wow. No windshield, nothing to really protect you. Nothing to, you maybe have a leather helmet on or something.
Possibly, instead of goggles. That's typical. You'll notice in a lot of those old pictures where people have the goggles, when they have their goggles up, there's inevitably a black ring around where they were. That's because these engines were putting out a lot of the same fluids that they were using to run. They were putting them right back into your face as we went down the road.
Anyway, it's a thrill to sit in this car.
It is a thrill. I wish we could take it out on the road for you guys. No one would like that more than Rick and myself. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen today. Maybe somewhere down the road we'll be able to get a few on the road and show you those videos as well.
Sure. Be great.
Well,
anyway, thank you so much for being here with us today and for sharing all your great insights into this great old car. You don't really get a chance to really appreciate it until you really look at them in depth. And in this case, to get a sit in them and really feel the car rather than just...
it's a completely different experience than looking at it. When they're going down the road, that's one thing, but sitting in them and actually touching them and feeling them and using the controls is a real treat for us as well. So we hope you've enjoyed it.
Well, again, thank you very much,
Thank you, Rick.
Well, again, my name is Rick Eberst. I'm a docent here at the Mullen Automotive Museum, and it's been my pleasure to host today another YouTube video about our 1911 Hispano-Suiza King Alfonso car. And we just want to remind you that please come and visit our website at mullenautomotivemuseum.com, and there is a spot on there where you can actually send us a message. So if there's a car that you would like us to feature on one of these events, please just drop us a note. We'll do our very best to get those examined if we can. But we certainly would love to hear from you, and we're certainly looking forward to seeing you right here in person at beautiful Oxnard at the Mullen Automotive Museum. So thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you soon.